thank you so much for being willing to speak with us, or speak with me before you speak with us. It's a real privilege and honour to be able to speak with you.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you.
I actually I was speaking to a colleague of mine who started about late last year from the Church of Wales, and he was saying that he knows a friend of yours, and that apparently I'm to tell you about the times you evaded PE.
Ah, yes. John Walters.
Yes. So no, it was quite funny, and to realise how small the world is.
Absolutely.
Although it feels quite large at the moment. So, do you want me to kick off with a question, or do you want to sort of?
I think kick off with a question.
Yeah. Well, I guess for me, those first few questions on that list were, what were some of the markers of spirituality in the early church, and then also when this sort of shift from kind of cultural rejection to majority status, how did that change the practice, and how did that shift our understanding of spirituality?
When you read the literature of the early church, I think you get a very strong sense that this was predictably a very cohesive community. You had to be if you were a persecuted minority. As one scholar of the early church said, if you were likely to be executed for meeting together, it helped to know who your next door neighbour was in a meeting, just to be sure. So there's that. And I think the intensity, particularly of a daily rhythm, comes through from very early on. We think of the daily round of morning and evening prayer and so on, and midday prayer as something that monastics do. But you do get a fairly clear sense there's an expectation in the early church that there's a common discipline that you keep up through the day, and even if you can't meet to do it, it's still there. And part of that discipline is also studying scripture. If you look at the sermons of somebody like Origen in the 3rd century, you realize, well, actually this man is preaching every day to Christian congregations, presumably very early in the morning, and they're not 5-minute sermonettes either. They're solid stuff. So all of that is part of what characterizes the first couple of centuries, and as it were, filling that out and surrounding it, the awareness of a real fragility. In certain periods especially, martyrdom is a real possibility. And therefore there's a powerful solidarity that comes through that. You're sharing a risk, and the relations you have with other Christian communities are an important kind of resource and perspective. You're a small group, you're a minority, you're a vulnerable minority, but you're not on your own. And the sense, therefore, that you are really living your way into death and resurrection must have been pretty strong. And the sense that you had to nourish yourself for that with a really intensive diet of prayer and scripture. Yeah, that's all there. So, of course, when it becomes something other than underground, what happens? Naturally, there are more people. You can't know everybody in the same way. The intensity wears off. And, of course, that is the point at which some people say, well, we've got to keep up the intensity in another way. So the monastic movement begins as a way not of doing something new and special, but of living out the baptized life in the old style, outside the normal social conventions, just to make sure that the church still has in it a kind of scarlet thread of focus and intensity. So I think that's something of what's going on, especially in the 4th century.
That's really fascinating, because I never really thought about the dimension to which the monastic tradition was the sort of continuation of that. I'd sort of always thought of it as the church recognizing something, so I think I've understood it within that mindset of the church in decline, so we had to kind of protect things, and that's sort of where it's developed out of. But that's quite fascinating to think the continuation of that early church life.
I think so, because the writers of the 2nd and 3rd century, like Clement and Origen, they are writing for a general Christian population, but it's their material, it's their insights that are used by the monastic writers later on, as if there's a natural continuity there. So the way in which somebody like Origen in the 3rd century begins a kind of analysis of our inner life, the balance of reason and emotions, the way in which we understand the levels at which we live, all that feeds into the monastic movement and becomes part of this extraordinary, very sophisticated diagnosis of how our wills and our imaginations work. And for my money, if you want to see early Christian spiritual insight at its deepest, you look to some of those writers at the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century, who were building on the earlier work of people like Origen, and really making it a kind of, I don't know, almost a handbook for the daily life of monks. These are things to watch out for. These are the potholes in the road. These are the traps you set for yourself. These are the images that'll get in the way of the truth, and so on and so on.
So you sort of, as you say that they're written essentially for the monks. These are the potholes to watch out for. To what extent did those transfer out of the monastic life into the daily life of the church? Were the practices similar, or was it sort of a very bifurcated world?
It's a difficult question to answer, really, because we don't know very much about the day-to-day life of ordinary lay people. But a couple of straws in the wind here. One is, of course, the fact that texts that were written originally for monks do circulate. We know they circulate outside monasteries because they're not just preserved in monasteries. So they become part of the world of literate people. And right up to, let's say, the 19th century in Russia, thinking of the Eastern Church, you have some of this tradition represented by the great anthology called the Philokalia, and it's translated into Russian in the 19th century. It's something that lay people are expected to read because the insights are not peculiar to monks. Second straw in the wind is one of the stories told in the 4th century about St. Anthony, one of the greatest monastic founders. It's told of other people as well. It's obviously a story that was kind of in the air. Antony's worried about whether he's making sufficient spiritual progress. And so an angel takes him to the back streets of Alexandria and introduces him to a doctor who's working in the back streets of Alexandria with the poor. And he does his job. He says his prayers. And the angel says to St. Anthony, "You're about as good as he is." And that's an interesting kind of switch of perspective, as if the monks themselves are saying, we're not an elite. We're not better than everybody else. We're trying to find a way of being the kind of unself-conscious good disciple that a doctor in the back streets of Alexandria might be. So, yeah, I think although you can get the message that monks think of themselves as elite and superior, and some do, you do also have this repeated emphasis on the right kind of humility, as if the monks are often saying, well, the reason I'm a monk is that I'd be useless being a doctor in the back streets of Alexandria. The reason I'm a monk is I need all this discipline to focus even for 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's quite a fun. I like that line. The reason I'm a monk is I'd be useless as a doctor. I think I'm not quite a monk, but I might borrow that line at some point.
Well, you might find a good many modern monks who'd say something like that.
So I suppose then the question of the practices that were developing in the monastic world amongst the monks and others to help guide them in their spiritual journey and their walk and their bending of their will towards God. How many of those do you think are practicable outside of the monastic world, and how would they translate to that world?
The rather surprising thing is that probably most of them are. Quite clearly, getting up several hours in the middle of the night isn't very practical unless you happen to have a small baby, in which case you've got no choice in the matter. Been there, done that. But saying the whole book of Psalms every day, things like that, oh, right, don't go there. But two things which I think are really transferable. One is the development, certainly by the 5th, 6th century, of the practice of a prayer that uses a simple phrase repeated over and over just to anchor yourself. So in the work of John Cassian, trained in Egypt, goes to the south of France to find a monastery there. So he's a big bridge figure between the two halves of the Christian world. Cassian takes the phrase from one of the Psalms, "O God, make speed to assist me. Come quickly to my help." Just say that. God, come quickly to my help. And you say that during the day at intervals when you have a moment, or you sit down or kneel down and just say it steadily. And that morphs into what's called the prayer of Jesus. In the work of some of these early writers, you repeat, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." And you just say that with every breath for a period of however long, half an hour maybe. And that's something which again has a great afterlife in the Greek and the Russian tradition, still very much part of that tradition today, and increasingly part of the discipline of Western Christians too. I've used that prayer for the last 50 years, every day, in that way. So that's one thing which is certainly translatable from the monastic world. And then, of course, people have recovered, haven't they, in the last couple of decades, this tradition of Lectio Divina, divine reading, which means a way of reading the Bible which doesn't look for a kind of moral or message to be distilled. You just read it out loud in a group, one by one, and each one of you picks out a word or a short sentence that has kind of clicked for you, and you just share it, and you let everybody think about it, and then you say a bit about why it matters, and somebody else says a bit about why their phrase matters, and it's a kind of well, you know, in reaction to the fast food chains around us, some people are now going for slow food. Restaurants advertise themselves as slow food environments. This is a slow food way of approaching the Bible. You just let things land. So things like that, they certainly transfer. And just saying the Psalms, and not necessarily in the strict forms that monastic orders use, but the Psalms are amazingly versatile. They still carry that charge of meaning for people because they give you an opportunity to express feelings that may be complicated, that may be negative. You know, I'm feeling lost, I'm feeling abandoned. God, where the hell are you? It allows you to say, you know, I really hate some people. I absolutely hate them. I wish they were dead. And say that in the presence of God and feel, if you like, the love of God just saying, okay, you've said that, now forget it. You know, that's part of how the Psalms work.
Mm. Yeah, that is profoundly true. I'm one of the hallmarks that I've loved about morning prayer has been that engaging with the Psalms in a real way, because often even on a Sunday it's kind of lost in like the busyness of everything else, that actually that daily engagement with it, you find things in there that one part of you thinks, is that in the Bible?
Yes,
but also, I say that was very much, I mean, I might not say it about that person, but it was very much a feeling that I've had as well, and that is profoundly powerful, isn't it?
It is, yes. And the Psalms go from those sort of rebellious or negative or doubting moments to these amazing evocations of the power of God in creation, you know, the storm that splits the trees and makes the goats in the field drop their kids prematurely, God in that. And then the psalm I really love, Psalm 104, which just describes the daily round. You know, the sun comes up, the nocturnal birds and animals retreat, and human beings go forth to their work and their labor till the evening. And the circle of life is there. And the psalmist is just sort of standing back and saying, amazing, isn't it?
Mm.
It's all happening. There it is. And I'm part of this.
Actually, there's something in that actually leads me to one of our other questions, which is the trappings of a modern society that are dangerous to our spiritual practice. And that you've spoken of that simplicity of the basic life, almost Luther's cow-maid kind of thing, of the way in which daily bread is brought to us. And yet our modern life can feel very, well, I start in the morning, but I'm still going at night in most cases. So what would you say in our contemporary context are some of the big dangers towards the sort of spiritual practices that help guide our wills to God and remind us of God's graciousness?
Yeah. One of the funny things about the modern world, of course, is that while we're told all the time to be very negative and very stern about addictions, it's a culture that feeds addiction. It says, you like this, and if you like this, you like that. And if you like that, you want more of it. Just the way in which online advertising works. The algorithms that tell some machine somewhere in California what you've just looked at, immediately, now you want this too, won't you? And that's a way of luring people into addiction. The sense that you are naturally on a journey which is one of greater and greater acquisition, that you won't be able to be patient about getting things. You'll need to cement your identity and your value with all these things. And also the way in which online communication sometimes works, social media. I'm only real if I've got lots of followers and lots of likes. I've got to be out there. And people have talked about this often enough, haven't they? The enormous pressure on the mental health of young people who get sucked into that. Again, it's an addiction. The addiction to being seen and being affirmed, with the counter danger of being seen and being trashed and trolled by people. So all of that certainly gets in the way. But without wanting to throw it all onto modern media and social media in particular, these are problems that have always been with us. It's not as if 500 years ago people were instinctively holier and less addicted in their own way. But I just find it interesting that we tolerate such a high level of seduction into these addictive forms of behavior, and we seem not to notice quite what we're doing there. So there's that. And I think also because we live in a deeply self-conscious culture, we're sort of jumpy, thin-skinned, aware of all the subtleties of speech and action. We're primed to be sensitive to offense and put down and disadvantage. And there's a good side to that, because we've tolerated all kinds of injustice in the past. But because we are so self-conscious, giving ourselves unself-consciously to the world, to one another, to God, can feel that much harder. We're always dealing with pictures of ourselves, with, as I say, that sense of, being perhaps in the wrong ways vulnerable, being so easily wounded, so easily defeated, so easily marginalized. We've become rightly sensitive to the way we marginalize and demean one another, and perhaps wrongly sensitive at times to the ways in which we can ourselves claim the status of disadvantage or victimhood. Complicated world we live in, but none of that helps in clarity of diagnosis about who we are, where we should go. This is why I think what I call the diagnostic tools developed by the early monks are so very interesting, because what they would call in their language the passions of the soul, the 8 great passions from which we get the 7 deadly sins ultimately, these are just the monastic teachers saying, Now, look out for this. There are circumstances where you're going to feel angry. Nothing wrong with feeling angry, but what are you going to do with it? There are circumstances where you're going to feel greed or lust. Okay, fine, it happens, don't panic, but what are you going to do with it? And so they help you watch the ways in which your imagination and your desires work, so that you're able to say, okay, that's in my mind, let's look at it, let's not hurry this. What's that desire about? Where's it coming from? Might be good, might be bad. Let's just put it in context. Let's not be driven by kind of automatic triggers. And that kind of careful, self-aware, not self-conscious, but self-aware treatment of how our feelings are working. I think there's brilliant advice there in the desert monks and others.
Just listening to that, I'll list off the 7 deadly sins for those watching that might not know them. I was, prior to this role, I was a chaplain at a boys' school, and they loved the 7 deadly sins, so I kind of remembered them relatively well. But of course, lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride are the 7 deadly sins. I'd love to know what the 8th one that we didn't think was that bad is.
No, interesting you ask, actually, because the 8th, which doesn't quite make it into the list, is usually a kind of spiritual apathy. It's a kind of refinement on sloth, but sloth not as laziness, but as whatever, and that's connected very often in the literature with the noonday demon phrase you sometimes hear, because one of the early teachers said, if you're in the desert as a monk, you've done your morning prayer, you've done a bit of work in the morning, and there are hours to get through, and it's not quite lunchtime. And this is the point, he says, at which you begin to think, I'm not sure this life is such a good idea. Or you may think, I've got to find something to do, I've got to distract myself. Just sit down and shut up is the answer. Recognize that one of the great 8 passions has got hold of you, and the devil has found a way in. Just look it in the eye, name it, and say, okay, now I live with it. What am I going to do with this?
Quite fascinating calling it a passion, in the sense that it feels the opposite, but it's exactly. I feel like we've missed a beat by not having that one, and that I'd almost say that a large number of the people, especially within the non-Christian sort of world that I speak to, apathy towards all things spiritual in general is quite a truthful statement. It's just a shoulder shrug. And the way in which that's kind of taken hold. But the other thing I wanted to talk about, and a little bit of a divergence, but it's the way in which so much of what you've spoken about of that tradition sounds like therapy today. And the correlation that seems to exist there between, I'm not necessarily wanting to say that it's therapy, but the modern, or I hate saying the modern world, our contemporary society has taken hold of some of this tradition, sort of desacralized it and turned it for profit, but in a lot of cases, as we do. But the relationship there, would you be able to elaborate on that at all?
Yes. Certainly, the spiritual writers of the tradition think of what they're doing as therapy. Therapia, it's healing, literally, in Greek. And the passions of the soul are the kind of disorders and the maladjustments that go on within, and so they need to be healed. They need to be restored, not eradicated, but restored to proper balance. But that's only half the story. And because it's quite hard work dealing with all this, it takes up a lot of space in many of the writings, but it's the gateway to something else. So writers will say, when you've begun to get these instincts, passions, and all the rest of it a little bit in perspective, then the door opens into love. And that love is, of course, primarily your freedom to receive from God what God wants to give through you to others. That's the point at which you recognize that, as St. Anthony, the monastic founder, says, your life and your death are bound up with your neighbor. So you can't live and you can't die alone. Like it or not, you're locked in with other human beings. And love is your way of making that creative, not destructive. So, yes, it's therapy. And I don't think we should be embarrassed about that. But it's therapy within a particular context. It's therapy which is part of a longer journey to, in the simplest terms, restore the image of God in us, or make us aligned with the life and vision of Jesus Christ. So not just making us feel better about ourselves, certainly not making us feel better about ourselves, sometimes making us feel quite a lot worse about ourselves and thinking, oh, am I that much of a mess? But on the road to that deep restoration.
Drawing on a little bit of your capacity as a cultural critic then, how much as I listen to that, and I'm a product of the 1990s and early 2000s, it's sort of when I grew, and the propensity to work out how to sell things is strong. It's an innate part of, I say youth, I'm not young anymore, of millennial culture and Gen Z culture. It's just there. We sell ourselves on Facebook, we sell ourselves on Instagram, we sell ourselves as a market, but also within the dating world of Tinder and other things like that. Mm-hmm. What you've spoken to there of an otherness life, a life that is directed in love to extend to others what God wishes to do through us, sounds profoundly unsellable. And how do we as the church, even within our church, there is that, I shouldn't say our church, the church, there is that consumerist sort of capitalistic reality that has infiltrated us into our souls.
Yeah, it really is, isn't there?
How do we begin the journey of bringing ourselves back to a place where we can, beyond the Damascus Road experience, how do we bring people, whether it's ourselves or others that we know, to what are the beginnings of these practices? What are the beginnings of that journey?
Two ways in, perhaps, here. One is picking up what you were saying about making things sellable. If God is the kind of God we say God is, then, of course, the one thing we absolutely can't do with God is sell ourselves to him. We have absolutely no need to persuade God that we're worth investing in, because God has already, eternally, invested in us, because we're here. And God has shown the depth of that investment in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. So, the whole economy is turned on its head. And what we have as believers trying to grow in faith and trust is a way into a world where selling and buying, exchange, debt, earning, succeeding are utterly irrelevant to the love that is being shared. So one thing then is just to try to get back to what kind of God it is that we really believe in. It sounds obvious, really put like that, but it's surprising how many people work with a very, very rum idea of God indeed. And I've occasionally said that one of the tasks of the church is at times to stop people believing in God, or at least believing in some gods. People will come with a God very much made in their own image, or in the image of somebody who has dominated or frightened them, and they'll need to be released from that God to meet the real one. And it seems that is exactly what Jesus is talking about doing in his whole life. It's a very strange thing that the story, the history of Jesus living and dying, which is so much about shattering that model of God, has sometimes been used by Christians to reinforce just that notion of a God who has to be kept happy at all costs, which isn't quite the message I read in the life and death of Jesus, let's say. So that's one question. Let's just pause and think about the kind of God we believe in. Second thing is perhaps let's look at a few lives of people who've let this impact on them. Yes, in the spirit of a famous scene from a famous film, When Harry Met Sally, it's what I think of as the "I'll have what she's having" principle of evangelism. Does it look as if these lives are lived with a degree of fullness, a degree of centeredness? And very often that is as persuasive as anything else. Look at a life lived in the awareness of that freedom to give to others what God gives to you, and you may well see there a pattern of life which breaks away from anxiety, which breaks away from hostility, suspicion, fear, self-protectiveness, and the kind of shrinking and shriveling that goes on with all those things. If, let's say, let's put it very bluntly, given the choice, if people were presented with two kinds of life, you can, by some miraculous gift of God, you can spend the rest of your life living like Desmond Tutu, or you can spend the rest of your life living like Donald Trump. I have some confidence in the common sense of an awful lot of people who say, well, on the whole, they'd go for the Desmond Tutu option.
There is something true in that, isn't there? I know a few people who might pick the Donald Trump option, but the characters in themselves.
We pray for them.
Well, diplomatic answer. You mentioned earlier about our tendency, I can't remember quite the way you worded it, but the language around success. Yes. We're driven towards success, but actually, we can't necessarily succeed any more with God than we already have. I know in my own sort of spiritual journey at times, spiritual practice has been a means to success in the sense that, I'm looking for that breakthrough, or I'm looking that, God's going to speak to me audibly this time, or, whatever variation on it. What do you think? First, I guess the question there is, what are the dangers of us taking an unbaptized understanding of success into our spiritual practice? Yeah. And then from that, what does success look like in our spiritual practice in a baptized form?
Yes, that's a brilliant question. And I think you've already answered it in a sense by using the word an unbaptized approach to success. Because success is something I desperately need in order to be secure. Well, step back and think, so let's not ask about the success. Let's ask about the insecurity first. Where's that coming from? And let's tackle the root there, because the root is fear, unconfidence, the sense of being lost unless we're on top of things, and all the rest of it. Very real, not wicked. It's just there. If you approach success with that mentality, unexamined, unrecognized, well, it's never going to be enough. It's never going to work. You're going to be driven into tighter and tighter spirals. So I think that's important. And if you carry that over into, as you say, into a spiritual practice, you feel you've got to get right. Something's gone wrong. Years ago, I was at a conference on basically on psychotherapy and the church, and we were talking about various techniques of human relations education, sort of thing that was fashionable back in the 1980s. And at the end of the conference, when we were all asked what had we learned, somebody said, I've learned that human relations education is a very good servant and a very skillful master. It can get a grip. Even the techniques of non-judgmental opening up, it can become another trick, another tactic. So you You say, I'm not sitting an examination in this. I'm working, paradoxically, I'm working hard so as to be open and effortless. And it sounds odd, but yet, if you think about learning a language, learning a musical instrument, learning how to play a game well, actually, that's what's going on. You work hard in your practice so that there can be an unself-consciousness at the end of it, a naturalness in what you're doing, without clenched muscles and furrowed brow. So that's how we need to approach, I think, the disciplines of the spiritual life, not things we have got to get right, certainly not things that have got to produce results. I was asked not long ago, actually, about how we should think of results in this kind of context. Do we expect meditation, contemplation, spiritual discipline, do we expect it to have results? Well, yes and no, of course. Yes, we do, because we undertake this so that we will become a different sort of person at the end of the day. If we try to measure this, we're always at risk of aborting the process of growth, pulling up the roots before there's been time to see the growth, taking the roots up from the earth where they belong, and saying, well, it's got to be working by now. So that patience and prosaic hanging in there do play a very significant part.
I really appreciated that kind of image of almost a sports practice. And former roles have been various coaches and played sports myself. And I remember one boy that I was coaching as a cricketer, and a wonderful bowler, brilliant bowler, but absolutely terrified at the batter's end because the ball was coming far too fast for him. And it took months of him sitting in the batting cage to get over the anxiety that before the ball had even left the bowler's hands, the anxiety of what was going to come, so that he could be present to take on the experience of the ball coming. And there's something of a great sort of similarity there. Obviously, one's might lead to more physical pain if you're not paying attention, but that similarity of almost the practice, so that when the moment of testing, or the moment of testing's not the right word, but you know what I mean by that.
I know what you mean.
Or actually, you can approach it unanxiously. You can approach it as it is, which is a ball coming towards you. You put your bat out and you knock it away, as opposed to the ball's going to hit me in the head. I better, flagrantly throw it around in the hope that it's going to stop.
Yeah, exactly.
Thinking back, you spoke earlier of the idea of the spiritual practices, in a sense, as diagnostic tools. And what I've sort of, as we've come through this conversation, it's really drawn back to that a lot of times, and that it's almost that the practices itself is not about becoming better at something, or having necessarily even a deeper connection or deeper sense of spirituality, but rather drawing forward those things that are perhaps, as the ancients would speak of it, the passions that are perhaps disordered in our lives, that are not in their rightful place and not functioning.
Yes, that's right. It's a matter of getting things out into the light a bit. And of course, not only the light of your own mind, but the light of God. As if God is saying to us about our lust, our greed, our anger, or whatever, look, just get it out here where I can see it, will you? Just put it out in the open. Then we can deal with it. Then something more of grace is released, because you've acknowledged something, you've brought it out, and now we see what we can make of it. And that's also connected, I think, with what many of the early writers talk about in terms of what they call manifestation of thoughts. If you've got a spiritual father, a spiritual mother, a director, a friend, a companion on the road, try to find somebody to whom you can actually be transparent about your thoughts. This is going on. What am I going to do about it? And someone you trust not to panic or to recoil, when you say things like that. If you say, I know this sounds ridiculous, but I have this obsession with eating chocolate at a certain time of the day. Translate that into other kinds of behavior as best you can. But I have this obsessive fugue about some things. I can't get these images out. And you want somebody who'll say, not, oh dear, that's disgusting. Or someone who'll say, well, never mind, I expect it'll go away soon. But someone who'll sit down and say, now let's look at where this is coming from. Let's look at the practices you just might adopt to get your mind off this. Let's see what will break the cycle a little bit. And, don't rush this. Let's see how it can be healed. So the older and the younger brothers and sisters in the desert, that's the currency of what's going on between them. Someone coming and saying, these are the things that besiege me. And someone else saying, okay, let's just look at those. Don't run away. Don't panic. Keep taking the tablets, as it were. Just keep, as one famously said, look, if you're in a state of spiritual despair, just eat when you're hungry, sleep when you're tired, and never despair of the mercy of God.
That's a lovely way to put it. As I think of that, it's that sense of accountability is not quite the right word, but that true sort of spiritual partnership, spiritual mentor walk, fellow walker. In what ways? No, it's not really the question I was going for. You spoke earlier of the fact that the monastic tradition sort of stepped out from the mainline church, the main body, because they were struggling to keep those practices. And I think as I look at the church today, in a lot of ways we're individuals who come to be a body for an hour and then we step back again. How much would you say the capacity of our spiritual practice to be, again, not successful but effective, or to actually be a practice for something, how much does that tie to integration into the local body, into the church, and being a member more than an attender?
Very much so, I think. Very much so. It's not nothing that we come together for an hour a week, and I don't think we should make little of it. As people often say, we need to be grateful for the people who do turn up. But if you want to grow through it a bit, then I think it's important to have perhaps smaller groups that will work together on this. Not terrifyingly extra pious groups, but just the kind of group where you can perhaps do Lectio Divina together and just get your thoughts out there. And perhaps with one or two very special people, find a way of sharing the things that trouble you, the things that oppress or besiege you. Because we need that perspective from another. We need another to show us something of the relentless but unjudging presence of God. God can't help being God. There's no way God can be less than God. So there will be what I call a relentlessness about it. God's God, and if we're going to be adjusted in some way to the life of God, my goodness, we're going to have to change. But that doesn't mean that God is sitting there twiddling his thumbs waiting for us to get better and frowning while we struggle. Because God is immediately there, and grace and welcome are given before we've ever arrived. And those two things together, what Paul calls the kindness and the severity of God, they're just part of God being God, and God can't help being God.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting that, and I think also kind of a beautiful way of recognising, I've used sort of quite a bit of your time already, a beautiful way of rounding that in the sense of our practice is responding to this God that has responded to us in a lot of ways, a God that is full of kindness, and yet because God is God, a sense of severity from our side, because we can't shape it, we can't sell ourselves to it, and we can't we can't do anything to change him. So it's quite a beautiful statement there.
Well, 'tis mercy all immense and free, for oh my God, it found out me, as Wesley put it.
Yes,
Yeah.
but we may not have made we may have made a mistake kicking him out.
Serious mistake.
It all works out in the end. But thank you so much for that, Dr. Williams. It has been deeply appreciated by me, and I know that those who will be along at the conference and those who will be able to share in this afterwards as well will appreciate that insight. Certainly, as we've talked, it's almost been a diagnostic tool for myself in the way that I approach some of my spiritual practice, not necessarily with that sense of becoming a better thing, but that concept of success and why do we practice, and actually the fact that almost all of our practices are spiritual practices. So profoundly helpful to me, and I'm sure to those who have also gathered.
Well, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to meet you and to have this conversation. I'm just very glad if anything I've said lands for people and makes some sense to them. But thanks for the opportunity.